Hello again, my lovelies, and welcome back to another review from Through the Eyes of Enji, where we're trying to go through 101 films in 12 months to raise money for the Shoreby Village Players and We Are With You. So this week, we're not doing Tommyknockers. I'm sorry, I still haven't watched it, partially because Laura was going to watch it with me. I was just trying to get our schedules to coincide. So that's on the back burner. I'm hopefully going to get that watched with the Meg over the next few days, so I should be able to get those reviews out this week. But I knew I still had films on the list, so I went ahead to watch Star Trek the Motion Picture. So released in 1979, directed by Robert Wise, written by Gene Roddenberry and Harold Livingston, based on a story by Alan Dean Foster. Starring William Shatner as Captain Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy, James Doohan as Scotty, George Takei as Sulu, and Nichelle Nichols as Uhura. When an alien spacecraft of enormous power is spotted approaching Earth, Admiral James T. Kirk resumes command of the overhauled USS Enterprise in order to intercept it. Just for the record, I watched the theatrical cut of the Star Trek the Motion Picture and not the reputedly better director's cut. Probably worth pointing out as well my history with Star Trek. I watched the original series on and off while I was at uni. I watched The Next Generation while it was on TV on Sky One when I was younger. I've watched bits and pieces of Deep Space Nine, but by that time I'd moved on to other things. I've never watched Voyager or Enterprise. I haven't read any of the tie-in novelizations. I have seen all of the films apart from 4 and 5. I've never watched Enterprise. I couldn't get past the first episode of Star Trek Discovery. I've seen the new trilogy. The first one I'm reviewing for this, so I won't comment on. But Into Darkness I thought was dreadful, and Star Trek Beyond I thought was boring. And I tried to watch Picard. I got a couple of episodes in and lost interest. So that's me with Star Trek. It's the version I watched. And now we just need to ask the obvious question of, do I really need to do this review? I mean, do I really have to? Because the reputation of the first Star Trek film is pretty well known at this point, with nicknames of the slow motion picture or the motionless picture. And those nicknames describe the film far better than I possibly can. But when nominations were coming through for the list of films, I was nominated to do 2 Star Trek films of my choice. And I mentioned this to my dear brother from another mother, and he suggested that I do one of the best and one of the worst, one odd, one even. And that's when we discussed it a bit further. We agreed that for one of the better ones, rather than do The Wrath of Khan, which is what everyone would suggest because it's supposed to be one of the best, I decided to do one next gen, one original series. So I decided to go for Star Trek First Contact as a next gen film. And for the original series, whilst I would have preferred to have done The Undiscovered Country, because it's my favourite of the original series ones, Colin suggested I said I was going to do a bad one. So that's how I got saddled with doing Star Trek the Motion Picture. At least, you know, the difference between the two, at least stuff happens in First Contact. Although, having done some further reading to try and understand what the hell happened with the production of the motion picture, I did find there's an ongoing fan theory that was solidified by William Shatner that the life form that's created at the end of this film is in fact the first of the Borg. So there is kind of this faint link between the two films. And yay? Also, I saw that Shatner, after seeing this film, believed he had just helped kill Star Trek. 15 years later, he reflected and said something along the lines of, shows what I know. I mean, I know that's not particularly relevant, but hell, I found it entertaining. Well, more entertaining than anything in the film, to be honest. I don't really think we need to discuss the impact of Star Trek, although I would like to highlight one part of its history that will probably become more relevant when I pull Green Lantern out of the jar, when we will inevitably wind up talking about Hal's Emerald Attack Team. So when Star Trek was facing cancellation after the second series in 1968, Gene Roddenberry encouraged student-led protests in the January of that year, which resulted in over 1,000 students from 20 different schools around America marching on the studio to protest the cancellation of Star Trek. And this coincided with Roddenberry starting to write to Beau Trimble, who led an organised writing campaign to save the series. And the studio, NBC, started to receive about 6,000 letters a week. It's been noted that this campaign started the first organised Star Trek fandom. Now, this wasn't the first fandom by a long stretch. The first one I could find evidence of was in 1893, when fans of Sherlock Holmes started to hold public demonstrations of mourning following his death. And various science fiction fandoms started to spring up in around about the 1930s, which led to the first World Science Fiction Convention in 1939. Although it does seem there's a bit of a split in the 1970s between science fiction fandoms and from the rest of popular culture. And two of the main fandoms at the time were both TV shows that were put on by NBC, and that was Star Trek and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. Around about 1967, the phrase Trekkies was conned when Arthur Saha saw attendees of the World Science Fiction Convention wearing Vulcan pointy ears. There's something else you didn't know this morning. And it's probably worth identifying where in the timeline of the shows and the films that the motion picture fell. So the last episode of Star Trek, the original series, was aired 47 days before Neil Armstrong landed on the moon. And due to financial difficulties at the time, Roddenberry couldn't raise the $150,000, which would be $950,887 today, to buy back the rights to Star Trek. So he approached Paramount and put together Star Trek the Animated Series. There were issues with the cast. Leonard Nimoy was royally pissed off because he was told he was the only member of the cast who was refusing to return. So when he did, he was unhappy when he found that George Takei and Uhura and Nichelle Nichols hadn't been invited to return anyway. So he insisted that they return to voice the characters. And the TV show actually only ran for a year and a half, rather than the 5 seasons that were originally planned. However, the fan support for all things Trek was still growing. In 1974, the second Star Trek convention had 15,000 people attend, in comparison to the 4,500 that attended the World Science Fiction Convention in the same year. And this led Paramount to hire Roddenberry to produce a feature film of Star Trek. Originally, it was going to be used to launch a new Paramount-owned TV network. But these plans were scrapped, and the project was reworked into what eventually became Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now, I'm sure that Close Encounters of the Third Kind being a massive hit, and thus showing that sci-fi films other than Star Wars could be a big hit, had, of course, nothing to do with that. We'll come back to that. Now, TV translating into film isn't always a good thing. For some shows, it works because the premise of the film fits naturally on the big screen, with things like The Fugitive. Or the film would be a continuation of the TV show, but has bigger scenes and wouldn't work within a TV show's budget or within the technical constraints at the time. I know Firefly isn't as good as we remember, but Serenity is bloody brilliant. However, when you're just making a longer version of an episode of the TV show, and you're just filling in the extra hour of screen time with no action and long tracking shots with no cuts other than to show you people watching the long tracking shots, and these shots going on for over 5 minutes at a time, then that's when you're not making use of a different medium. Speaking of which, Star Trek the Motion Picture is fucking boring. Now, say what you will about Star Wars The Phantom Menace, but at least things happen in that film, and the film moves at a good pace. My initial impression when watching the Klingon vessels rocking up at the beginning of this film was, okay, that level of detail on the ships is pretty good. This feels like a production that has been given a massive injection of money and wants to flex those muscles for the first time. I considered this for some time because the opening of the film spends most of its time lavishly showing off these 3 Klingon ships before their inevitable destruction. I also found myself thinking about this again when we were watching the dry dock sequence with Kirk and Scotty, which is over 5 minutes long. Now, all this sequence is this little landing craft circling the Enterprise whilst the excellent Jerry Goldsmith theme plays. Now, the director of visual effects for this film, Douglas Trumbull, who it will surprise absolutely no one to learn also worked on 2001: A Space Odyssey, wanted this sequence to be, and I quote, "a beautiful epic sequence with no story, no plot, and no dialogue. Everything stops and lets the audience just love the Enterprise." Which is fine. I get that having the big moment when we see the Enterprise again for the first time on the big screen. It had been a few years at this point since Trek had been on the air, let's not forget. And again, being on the big screen for the first time with a big swelling of music, and you see the Enterprise, and it's this beautiful ship. But we don't need to take 5 minutes just to do that. And we don't need another longer sequence when the Enterprise sets out on its voyage for the first time. And we really don't need a 10-minute odd sequence of the ship slowly making its way into Vija for the first time. Laura, as usual, it seems, when I'm watching these films, popped into the room whilst I was watching that particular sequence. And we talked for a few minutes as to why both of us had struggled with connecting with Star Trek as a whole. Laura watched the film for a few minutes, asking me a couple of times variations of what the hell is going on and is this it? And Laura's interestingly, her least favourite Marvel films are the ones where it is just wall-to-wall action. She much prefers Marvel products like WandaVision, where there's dialogue and character development rather than just constant action. So you'd think she'd like Star Trek the Motion Picture because there's no fucking action. And I get that Star Trek is supposed to be about big ideas and a futuristic society. And when I'm watching Star Trek, I like seeing the day-to-day general running of the ship and getting set up for a big voyage or a big battle. And I love me a big space battle. But apart from some of the later Star Trek films, I never really got that. For the record, the best space battle ever put to film is still The Return of the Jedi. Yeah, I'll fight you on that. And what I can gather is part of the reason for the lack of anything resembling an action sequences, and that bloody wormhole sequence does not count, was at Gene Roddenberry's insistence. So the original draft of the script for the film involved the crew meeting God for the first time. And this is an idea that they return to in Star Trek V, which is a film so bad that even hardcore trekkers go quiet whenever it's mentioned. And these are the people who will defend fucking insurrection of all things. And the driving feeling behind the production of the film was that it should be different from, what else, Star Wars, by not relying on action sequences and should be a more thoughtful project. Which, okay, if you really want to push for it, meeting an all-powerful machine which has achieved sentience even, and the difficult moral choice which is raised whether to nurture this new life and direct it to make a positive contribution to the United Federation of Planets that you have created, or to give in to your basic human desires to destroy this entity in order to protect humanity, is a very Star Trek idea. But this moral question is never really discussed other than a couple of lines during a really fucking bizarre final sequence, which was reportedly an absolute bastard to film. And it doesn't give us a satisfying conclusion to the painfully boring couple of hours which have left us to this point. And the whole thing isn't helped by the fact that the film puts the original cast front and centre, because even at the time, if you weren't a fan of the original show, then it makes you feel like you're an unwanted guest at a party. And the interactions boil down to a group of grumpy middle-aged men bickering around Trek science fiction mumbo-jumbo, rather than trying to advance them as characters. So I'm watching this and I want to know why Kirk wants a Starship Command again, or why Bones has been essentially press-ganged into being back on the Enterprise. And instead we've got Kirk being a dick to the other members of the crew, Spock being a dick to pretty much everyone, Chekhov, Sulu and Uhura having fuck all to do, and Bones, oh, okay, fair enough, I've got a bit of a soft spot for Bones McCoy in any Star Trek product. So I'll just say he's a dick to Kirk and enjoys roasting Spock, which, to be honest, at that point of the film, is totally warranted. Now, it's well known that if we're going to deal with the elephant in the room, that the film which followed Star Trek: The Motion Picture was labelled as the best of all the Star Trek films. I mean, I don't think it is, but I suggest we'll reconvene on that one when we talk about Star Trek First Contact. The major difference I noticed between the motion picture and The Wrath of Khan is that the latter focused more on the characters, much like the best Star Trek stories do. Whereas the first one seems to have more of a focus on the special effects. And, well, I mean, the model work's good. I can't even say it was good for the time because this is a film that came out after 2001 and, of course, Star Wars, which looked better than the motion picture, and they moved at a pace that actually made it exciting to watch. Now, I haven't revisited A New Hope for a long time, and I think I will be covering it before this little quest of mine comes to its end. But I remember sequences in the films, like the longer take, where the Millennium Falcon is being drawn into the Death Star, and it was as long as it needed to be, so the crew on board can bicker and fight about their course of action while this brilliant John Williams dramatic score plays, and it lasts as long as it needs to. Whereas in Star Trek: The Motion Picture, we have the sequence where the Enterprise is slowly and painfully drawn into Vija, and there's no bickering, there's no sense of threat. We just watch the crew watch the ship moving slowly, so very slowly move forward, and someone then acknowledges that they're moving forward, and they move forward slowly, and you get the idea. I noticed a comment as I was watching the film that if you cut out the various sequences of circling the Enterprise and these slow transition sequences and that bloody wormhole sequence, and you have Spock on board from the beginning, then you could have fit this into an hour-long episode of the TV show. And we can see that the movie was intended to launch a new version of the TV show. And it shows when watching the motion picture. There are far, far better ways to spend your time than watching Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Just listen to the soundtrack while you're doing something else, like cooking a Sunday roast or doing the laundry. And there's certainly enough quality Star Trek material out there if you want that itch scratched that the likes of Discovery and Picard failed to scratch for you. Star Trek: The Motion Picture is not that. It's not even a good nostalgia piece. It's just a painfully boring film that's over 2 hours long and nothing fucking happens. If you want to re-release this, but just call it Star Trek: The Birth of the Borg, you're going to have people who are going to go watch it and are going to support it because they're going to be going, it's Star Trek and it's classic Star Trek and Kirk's the best captain, blah, 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 blah. It's just a painfully dull film that doesn't change anything. I seem to recall with the original series Star Trek films that it's always the Enterprise is being decommissioned and Kirk has to get it back again and again and again. Why not, if you're making a film version, have some fun with it? You know, have Kirk on his final voyage or whatever. Tell a big, exciting story. When DC did Superman, The Death of Superman, they had the chance to tell this really interesting story. It could be a final confrontation with Lex Luthor, sacrificing himself to save Lois Lane from Darkseid. It's all these fabulous big ideas, and they decided to end Superman with a fist fight with a giant alien. And I felt myself thinking about this process when I was watching the motion picture, because it was, how are we going to bring Star Trek back? All guns blazing. Why don't we have them discover a new alien race that's a threat to Earth? Let's have the Klingons, hell, just undiscovered country. Give us a prelude to undiscovered country. Let's have the Klingons economy be crippled and they launch a desperate attack against the Federation, and Kirk's stuck in the middle and he's somehow Scotty's got to get the Enterprise to do something phenomenal that no one's thought of before, and Spock sees an alternate, completely logical solution, and Bones calls him a dick, and Sulu, Uhura, and Chekhov wait in vain for scenes that focus around them to come but never do. And Kirk initially just wants to fist fight his way through it, and then he seduces some female alien because he always seemed to bloody do it. And then he thinks of this radical way of fighting his way through it. And that's your film. It's not finding a probe that's found. The Voyager probe finding a planet of machines is a great idea. Can't we have the Enterprise going to the planet of machines? There's so many different plays you could take in the motion picture to relaunch Star Trek, and it just feels like it's utterly dull idea that just doesn't do anything. This is a wasted time, space, and film. And you might have guessed from what I'm saying, but I don't recommend this. So next time we are hopefully doing Tommyknockers. It might wind up being the Meg if I don't get around to see Tommyknockers. And then we'll draw out a couple more films during the week. In fact, hang on, we'll do it now. So, we've only got one film left on the list. So, if you want to nominate a film, now's the time to do it. So, following Tommyknockers and the Meg, we're going to be doing Excalibur and The Two Popes. Brilliant. Righto. There's a few more films for me to watch, a few bit to work through. Thank you very much indeed, as always, for watching. £290 has been raised now, so we'll either split that up during the week, or we might well hang around, see if I can get another tenner, so I can just round it up to 150 quid for each one. Thank you very much for watching. Like the video, subscribe so you get notifications when I release new ones. Share it about a bit. Let's keep going. Thank you very much for watching. See you next time.